We're now going to move into a discussion on theory and research methods. So at this time, I'm going to start implementing the video clips as opposed to the audio clips. There are a few terms that I want us to talk about before we get into theory, because I'm going to introduce you today to three major sociological theories: structural functionalism, social conflict theory, and symbolic interaction. Each has its own way of looking at how the world works. But there are four terms I want us to talk about before. So I'm going to be looking in this direction from time to time because I'm looking at the notes that I put online for you. So I want to make sure I cover everything. So let's start with the first term: inductive reasoning versus deductive reasoning. Inductive versus deductive. When you start a research project, you want to take a certain approach. Either you do it inductively or you do it deductively. Now, inductive reasoning means that you move from specific observations to a conclusion. You start off in what they call a grounded theory perspective. So you don't know exactly what you're going to find. So you're open to what the research will reveal to you. So you take some observations and then you draw a conclusion or you build a theory based on what you see. So you start theory free and then you build towards a conclusion. Now, let me give you an example of how we do that every day. Let's say it's the month of April. It's cloudy outside. Feels a little damp. There's no sun. What might you conclude? Humid air. It's the month of April. It's cloudy and very little sunshine. Without even looking at a weather report, you might conclude it's going to rain. That's exactly how inductive reasoning works. You start off not knowing exactly what you're going to find, but you take observations and then you draw a conclusion. Now, let me give you an example of how that works sociologically. Let's say you're interested in studying the homeless population, but you've never been homeless and you don't know what their lives are like. So you decide to live for 6 months or so on the street. While you're living on the street, you might be living in shelters, sleeping in abandoned houses, but you're also interviewing people who are homeless because you become part of that community to find out how they got there. Then you begin to draw conclusions as to why people are homeless. Maybe the cost of housing is too high. Maybe they don't have family support. Maybe they lost their jobs and it's very hard for them to find jobs. So there's a problem with employment. There's a problem with affordable housing. There's a problem with having a safety net of social support. And from living in that situation, you begin to draw conclusions as to why people are homeless and what we can do as a society to provide the resources to get them out of that situation. Now, you didn't know what you would find. You just simply became part of that community, and through observation and interviews, you were able to draw conclusions. Now, let's look at the next one: deductive reasoning. Now, this is when you start off with a theory and then you seek data or observations to prove it. So let's say you believe that something relates to something else. You start off with a hypothetical guess, a scientific guess about what you're going to find. And then you set up a study to collect data and do an analysis to find out whether or not your theory is correct. That's deductive reasoning. So you start with fact, or you start with, a position, and then you build a study to find out whether or not you can prove or disprove your hypothesis. That's deductive reasoning. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you're interested in finding out if there's some type of correlation between the number of women who are murdered by male partners and women's changing status in society. Maybe you want to find out whether or not we can predict a rise in intimate partner homicides based on women's economic status improving, and thus they become less dependent on their male partners, which might threaten his power, which might make him want to harm her in a lethal way. You start off believing that that is the case. As women's economic status improves, then we're going to see an increase in the number of women killed by male partners. Now, I'm going to get back to this example later because I'm going to show you how regression analysis works using that same example. You start off with a theory and then you move to prove whether or not, or you set up a study gathering data, conducting an analysis to see whether or not your scientific guess can be proven by your research. Now let's look at two other terms: qualitative research versus quantitative research. Qualitative research is research that has data that is narrative. So your data are narrative. Your data is coming to you in the form of words, observations, content analysis. Maybe you're you're watching commercials to see how many times you see a heterosexual family with a number of children and so forth and so on. That's qualitative research. So the information is coming to you in the form of words. If you have a study that involves interviewing people, as you ask questions and people answer those questions, their answers to your question is data. And that is an example of qualitative research. Now, quantitative research is research that involves data that are numeric. So the data comes to you in the form of numbers or statistics. I mentioned regression analysis, where we can take numbers to see whether or not we can predict the outcome of one variable based on a change in another. So if you're trying to find out the extent of something, the extent of poverty in a particular country, the extent of domestic violence in a particular community, you're looking at numbers to describe human behavior, and that is quantitative research.